At 11:42 p.m., my son sent me an email. The subject line read, "We need boundaries." The message was brief. "Please stop showing up unannounced. Our brand image and family life require peace. Unless you are explicitly invited, please keep your distance from our lives." I sat in my dark study, staring at the cold glow of the screen, and then looked down at the checkbook resting on my desk. They wanted peace. I accepted their request quietly. I didn't call. I didn't argue. I simply turned off the desk lamp. But the very next morning, he was at my door with a bill. He thought I was just a ATM with a heartbeat. He forgot that I wasn't just his father. I was a veteran forensic accountant who knew the exact value of every square inch of the land beneath his feet. Before I tell you how I removed my only son from his flawless life, let me introduce myself. My name is Arthur Vance. I'm 65 years old. For nearly 40 years, I worked as a forensic accountant and independent auditor. My job was to track hidden assets, find fraudulent loopholes in financial statements, and calculate bankruptcy thresholds. I've helped put Wall Street fraudsters away and exposed complex Ponzi schemes. Yet I failed to notice the structural collapse of my own family finances until the roof was about to cave in on my head. It was a Tuesday evening. My San Francisco townhouse was incredibly quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy when you live alone. I was down at my workbench in the basement, where the air smelled of brass polish and machine oil. I was restoring a vintage 1960s brass astronomical telescope for my granddaughter Mia. She turned 9 last week and had become fascinated by astronomy. I wanted to surprise her. I was wiping the edge of the brass eyepiece with a velvet cloth when my phone buzzed on the workbench. It rattled loudly against the hard wood. I wiped the grease off my hands and picked it up. It was an email from my only son, Julian. His wife, Chloe, was CCC'd. Ever since his mother passed away from an illness 20 years ago, I had raised him on my own. The content of that email was cold and direct, exactly those words I mentioned earlier. They felt I was interfering. I read it twice, then a third time. I stood there waiting for a follow-up email, expecting him to say, "Just kidding," or "Sorry, wrong recipient." But the screen soon went dark. I stood in the chilly basement, my hands still covered in polish residue. I thought back to the last time I visited them. It was 3 days ago. I brought a crate of premium organic blackberries from the farmer's market because I knew Chloe was promoting an antioxidant diet on social media. I helped clear the clogged drainage ditch behind the winery tasting room because Julian didn't even know how to set up a ladder safely. I spent 20 minutes watching the horses by the stables with Mia, while the two of them sat on the patio sofa, staring at their phones the entire time. I didn't think that was interfering. I thought I was being a father, a grandfather. I looked at the telescope. I had spent nearly a month restoring it. I carefully set down the velvet cloth. I didn't throw my phone and I didn't yell. Forensic accountants don't lose control of their emotions. We only analyze data. I went upstairs to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. On the refrigerator, a calendar was pinned down by a Napa Valley Tourism Bureau magnet. I looked at tomorrow's date, the 15th. The 15th was a highly expensive day. That was the day funds were automatically debited from my accounts to pay for Mia's elite equestrian boarding school tuition. It was also the day I paid the heavy commercial property taxes and equipment loans for Oakmont Boutique Winery, the business Julian and Chloe ran. Legally speaking, that vast vineyard, the luxurious estate villa, and even the winery trademark belonged 100% to a holding LLC under my name. But to the outside world, they always called it their winery, a wine brand they built from scratch. They chose the font for the wine labels. They hosted the lavish tastings, and I was just the man behind the scenes signing the checks. "We want peace," the words echoed in the empty kitchen. They wanted the peace of my physical absence, but they certainly didn't want the peace of me stopping my financial support. I sat down at the kitchen table, picked up my phone, and typed a reply. I didn't write a long essay about how much I loved them, nor did I remind them of the sacrifices I had made. I only replied with 2 words. Understood. I hit send. Then I went upstairs, turned off the lights, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling. I didn't sleep. I was calculating. I was auditing the balance sheet of my relationship with my son, and I realized that besides my money, there was nothing left holding it up. The next morning, the sun rose as usual. I brewed black coffee, no sugar. As I sat in my armchair reading the Wall Street Journal, a knock came at the door. It was rapid and impatient. I looked at my watch. 7:15 a.m. I opened the door and Julian was standing there. He looked anxious. He was wearing the custom cashmere vest I bought him last year to celebrate the winery's 5th anniversary over a designer shirt. He didn't look at all like the person who had sent an email to banish his father 8 hours ago. He looked like an impatient customer in a rush. "Hey, Dad," he said, walking right past me without waiting for an invitation. "Got any coffee? I'm running late." I watched him walk into my kitchen, familiarly open the cabinet, grab a mug and pour a cup from my coffee maker. He acted as if nothing had happened, as if last night's email was just a dream I had. He took a sip and frowned. "Dad, you really need to get better beans. This tastes like mud." I slowly closed the front door. I walked into the kitchen and leaned against the marble countertop. I didn't speak. I just watched him. I looked at his expensive haircut and the Rolex on his wrist. I was looking for a sign of remorse, waiting for an apology. He set down the mug and pulled a folded piece of paper from his inside jacket pocket. "Look, about last night's email," he waved his hand dismissively. "Don't be dramatic. Chloe has been under so much pressure lately. She has to maintain the winery's luxury image on social media, and she feels like she can't relax in her own space when there's always an outsider around. We just need some boundaries. You understand boundaries, right? An outsider. At the winery I fully funded. At the estate where my granddaughter slept, I had become an outsider. I understand boundaries," I said, my voice calm and steady. "Great," Julian said. He smoothed out the piece of paper on the dining table. "Anyway, the timing isn't ideal, but the commercial-grade climate control pump for the wine cellar completely failed. I called the repair team yesterday, and they have to replace the whole assembly. They said they won't ship it unless it's paid in full. You know how it is since we booked that vacation villa in Tulum, Mexico for next month. Chloe's credit cards are maxed out, and my funds are tied up." He pushed the paper toward me. It was an invoice from the repair company. $3,500. "Dad, I need you to take care of this," he said, glancing down at his phone. "I have to meet a wine distributor at 9. If the cellar temperature isn't controlled, that batch of premium Cabernet Sauvignon will be ruined, and it'll look completely unprofessional in front of the client. Write a check quickly, and I'll drop off the payment on my way to work." He wasn't asking, he was commanding. He took it for granted. I looked at the invoice, then looked at my son. For the past 34 years, I smoothed over every bump in his road. I paid his expensive tuition at USC, and when he graduated with nothing to show for it, I funded the purchase of that land in Napa Valley, set up the company, and let him play the role of a glamorous young winery owner. I thought I was helping him build his life, but I wasn't. I was enabling his downfall. I turned him into a parasite who could send an email insulting his father in the middle of the night, yet confidently show up at dawn demanding money. I walked to the drawer where the checkbook was kept. I could feel Julian's eyes fixed on me, and I could feel his relief. He thought the crisis had passed, and that the boundaries were established. I would keep my distance, but my money had to be on call. I took out the checkbook and pulled the pen from my breast pocket. It was a Mont Blanc, a retirement gift from my accounting firm, heavy and elegant. Julian let out a long breath. "Thanks, Dad. You're a lifesaver." Seriously, Chloe was panicking last night. "Once things settle down in a few weeks, maybe we'll bring Mia over to see you." "In a few weeks, maybe." I opened the checkbook, wrote the date, filled in the repair company's name on the payee line, and wrote the amount, $3,500. I signed my name at the bottom, Arthur Vance. I looked at the check. It was a perfect piece of paper representing a safety net, a problem resolved by money. I tore the check from the book. In the quiet kitchen, the sound of the rip was incredibly sharp. Julian reached out his hand, his body already moving toward the door. "Awesome. I gotta run." Holding the check in my left hand, I looked him straight in the eyes. "You said last night that you wanted peace, Julian." "Yeah, Dad, I know. Let's not bring up old history. Just give me the check." I smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of an auditor who had finally found the undeniable smoking gun proof of financial fraud. "Peace is highly expensive, son," I said. Then with two slow and deliberate movements, I tore the check in half. I stacked the two halves together and tore them again. Julian froze. His hand remained suspended in midair, his mouth slightly open, completely speechless. He stared blankly as the blue paper scraps drifted from my fingertips and scattered across the kitchen tile floor. "Dad," he whispered in utter disbelief, "what are you doing?" "I'm respecting your boundaries," I told him. "You wanted to be an independent family. You wanted independence and space. I am granting you all of it, completely and unconditionally." "Are you insane?" he suddenly erupted, his face turning a furious shade of red. "I need that pump fixed. I have a major client meeting." "That sounds like a real problem for whoever fully owns that winery," I replied calmly. "But since you want to play king of your own castle, the king should pay to fix his own pump." "You're punishing me," he spat out, clenching his teeth. "This is so petty, so childish. Just because we asked for a little privacy." "I'm not punishing you," I cut him off. "I'm just retiring. I am officially stepping down from my position as your personal bank." I pointed directly at the front door. "Now get out of my house, Julian." He stood there, fists clenched tightly. He looked down at the shredded paper on the floor, then back up at me. He saw something in my eyes he had never seen before. He saw a hard line. "Fine. Great," he sneered. "Go ahead and be a cynical, miserable old hermit. Let's see if we ever invite you over again. Until you apologize for this stunt, you can forget about ever seeing Mia." He turned on his heel, stormed out, and slammed the front door so hard the window panes rattled in their frames. I stood alone in the kitchen. The silence returned, but this time it didn't feel heavy. It felt clean, like the refreshing clarity after a poorly constructed building is demolished and the dust finally settles. I took one more look at the calendar on the fridge. The 15th. I picked up my phone, but I didn't call Julian. Instead, I dialed a number I hadn't called in months. "Evelyn Hayes, corporate law," a voice answered on the second ring. "Evelyn, it's Arthur," I said. "Arthur? It's 7:30 in the morning. Is everything okay?" "Everything is fine, Evelyn. I need an appointment to see you today. I want to make some fundamental changes to the ownership structure and operating agreement of Oakmont LLC, specifically regarding the removal of management and the residency terms for the estate villa." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Evelyn was a brilliantly sharp, top-tier corporate attorney in California. She knew exactly what this meant. "Are you sure, Arthur?" she asked softly. "Once we initiate this liquidation and termination process, it's incredibly difficult to stop. This is effectively cutting off their life support." I looked down at the shredded remnants of the check on the floor. "I'm entirely sure," I said calmly. "They wanted peace, Evelyn, so I'm going to give them a bankruptcy war they can't afford to fight. But first, I'm going to finish my coffee." I hung up. The coffee had gone cold, but it tasted better than any cup I had drunk in years. I walked down to the basement and looked once more at the brass astronomical telescope. I picked up the polishing cloth. I still had work to do, but this time I was no longer building things to sustain their entitlement. I was dismantling the vanity project I had built for them, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. That was only the beginning. I didn't know it yet, but I had just lit the fuse on a bomb that would destroy my son's entire artificial life, and the explosion would be spectacular. The drive into downtown San Francisco's financial district was crisp and clear through the morning California fog. I didn't turn on the radio. My mind was already rehearsing the conversation, building logic and evidence the same way I would prepare for a brutal financial audit. I parked my worn Honda sedan in the underground garage of a sleek glass tower. This was where Evelyn Hayes managed the wealth of many of Silicon Valley and the Bay Area's quietest millionaires. I was one of them, though my son seemed to have forgotten that detail long ago. He looked at my scuffed leather shoes and saw only poverty. He never bothered to look at the underlying corporate registration filings to see where the real power was held. When I stepped into her corner office overlooking the bay, Evelyn didn't offer a hug. She knew me too well. She saw my tight jaw and the thick folder tucked under my arm. She simply pointed to the leather chair across from her mahogany desk, pressed the intercom button, and told her assistant to block all calls. Evelyn and I had known each other for nearly 30 years. She handled my late wife's probate and helped me establish the network of shell companies and trust funds. She was the only living soul who knew my net worth down to the penny. I sat down and placed the shredded check fragments onto her spotless desk. They were the only chaotic element in that perfectly ordered room. "I want to trigger the Section 7 absolute termination clause," I said. Evelyn paused, her hands freezing over her laptop keyboard. She looked at the torn paper, then glanced at me over the rim of her reading glasses. Her eyes were sharp, evaluating. "The Section 7 absolute termination clause of the operating agreement?" she repeated slowly. "Arthur, when we wrote that in, it was strictly as a nuclear deterrent. We never intended for you to actually use it. It gives you, as the controlling member, absolute authority to terminate the managing director immediately and reclaim all corporate assets, including the residence. If you pull this lever, there's no turning back. This is an open declaration of war." I leaned forward, my voice remaining low. "They declared war first, Evelyn. They just mistakenly assumed I didn't have any ammunition. Open the files. I want to see the master ledger. I want to see exactly how much money I've burned through on Julian and Chloe over the last 5 years." Evelyn typed a few commands. The laser printer in the corner began to hum. As the pages printed, she turned her screen toward me. "The numbers are ugly, Arthur," she warned. "I've been trying to tell you for years, but you always brush me off. You called it supporting a startup. I call it an uncontrolled hemorrhage." I looked at the spreadsheet on the screen. The numbers were staggering. It wasn't just the commercial property taxes on the Napa Valley vineyard or the sky-high California fire insurance. It wasn't just the estate maintenance. It was the endless stream of emergency capital injections. $5,000 to cover a luxury credit card bill, $10,000 to sponsor a European wine tasting trip they couldn't afford, and Mia's boarding school tuition debited directly from my high-yield dividend account. I ran my finger down the rows of data. In the last fiscal year alone, the total expenditure exceeded $350,000. That was more than I had spent on myself in the past decade. I looked at the line item labeled Estate Villa. That house was the epicenter of their arrogance. "Who holds the title on that property right now, Evelyn?" I asked. I knew the answer, but I needed to hear the objective legal truth spoken aloud. "Oakmont Holdings, LLC, owns 100% of the title." Her voice was crisp and clinical. "Julian and Chloe only possess occupancy rights as an employee benefit, tied to their status as full-time operating managers of the winery. Their right to live there is entirely contingent upon employment. They don't own a single blade of grass on that property." "And the employment contract?" I asked. Evelyn pulled up a second document. "Julian is registered as the Director of Operations for the LLC. He draws a salary of $12,000 a month, plus performance bonuses. His job description is intentionally vague, mostly handling brand development and public relations." "Has he developed a single profitable brand?" I asked. Evelyn didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence was the audit result. The winery had been operating at a loss from day one, entirely sustained by cash injections from my parent company to balance the books. I leaned back in my chair. A cold knot formed in my stomach. It wasn't anger anymore. It was shame. I had created this monster. I fed it with checks and silence. I taught my son that money fell like California sunshine, automatically whenever he needed it. I deprived him of the hardships required to become a real man. Now I had to become the drought that corrected it. "Draft the paperwork," I said. Evelyn took a deep breath, pulling a yellow legal pad toward her. "All right, let's be specific. What are we cutting off?" "Everything," I said. The word hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Evelyn began to write, her pen scratching rhythmically against the paper. "First," I continued, keeping my voice steady, "I need a notice to vacate. Terminate their employee residency for the Oakmont estate immediately. Give them the bare minimum required by California law. 30 days. "Understood," Evelyn said without looking up. 30 days to move out. If they refuse, we file for a formal unlawful detainer on day 31. It will go on to their public credit report, destroy their credit score, and ensure they won't be able to rent so much as a decent apartment in the future. Are you prepared for that consequence? I thought back to the email. We need boundaries. I'm prepared, I said. Next, the employment contract. Terminate his position as Director of Operations immediately under the at-will employment clause. No severance. The high salary he drew for 5 years of zero results is his severance. Evelyn nodded and flipped the page. What about her tuition? Evelyn asked softly. That's the hardest part, Arthur. Mia. I closed my eyes for a single second. I saw Mia's face, the excitement in her eyes when I used to explain the constellations to her. She was the innocent bystander in this war, but I knew if I kept funding things directly, Chloe would inevitably divert the money to maintain her own lavish lifestyle. I had to bypass the parents to save the child. Stop the direct tuition payments through their account, I ordered. Instead, set up a new irrevocable educational trust. Put everything she'll need from now until college graduation into it. Lock it down completely and stipulate that the funds can only be released directly to the educational institutions. Neither Julian nor Chloe can touch a single penny. If they want Mia to stay in that elite equestrian school, they'll have to pay the monthly boarding incidentals themselves. If they can't afford it, the money will just sit in the trust, compounding interest, ready for when Mia goes to college. Evelyn stopped writing. She looked up at me with a strange expression, a mix of awe and sympathy. You've calculated the entire board, haven't you? I'm a forensic accountant, Evelyn. I don't push the demolition button until I've calculated the blast radius. One last thing, I added. The renovation loan. Evelyn frowned. Which one? There have been so many over the years. The one from 2 years ago. The $50,000 they borrowed for Chloe's so-called influencer tasting room project. I lent them that money from my personal savings, not through the company. We have a signed promissory note, right? Yes, she said. A demand note. Payable in full whenever the lender requests it. Call it in, immediately. Evelyn set her pen down. Arthur, she whispered, if you demand payment on that note right now and they can't pay, which we both know they can't, you can file for a judgment. You can freeze Julian's bank accounts and even put a lien on any assets truly in Chloe's name, like her jewelry or her car. You will bankrupt them within a week. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the street below. People were rushing to work, worrying about bills, anxious about the future. Meanwhile, my son was probably sitting in his vineyard office with a panoramic view, boasting to suppliers about his upcoming luxury trip to Mexico, fully confident his father would patch every financial leak before lunch. He told me he wanted independence, I said to the glass. He told me I was suffocating them. I'm just giving him some fresh air. I turned back to Evelyn. Execute all the documents, Evelyn. Every single one. Serve the termination and eviction notices using a court-authorized process server. I want a professional to hand the papers directly to him, and he has to sign for them. Evelyn clacked away at her keyboard for the next 20 minutes. In the quiet office, the keys sounded like rapid gunfire. I sat there watching the printer spit out page after page of devastating legal power. These weren't just pieces of paper. They were the termination order for my son's prolonged adolescence. He was 34 years old, but his childhood was ending today, Tuesday at 10:45 a.m. She pushed the stack across the desk and handed me a heavy black rollerball pen. Read them carefully, Arthur, she said, her tone formal. Once you sign these, the machine starts. Once notices are served, I can't reverse the process. I didn't read them. I knew what they said. I trusted Evelyn, and more importantly, I trusted my own resolve. I signed my name on the first page, Arthur Vance, controlling member. I signed on the second page, Arthur Vance, creditor. I signed on the third page, Arthur Vance, father. The last signature was the hardest. My hand trembled for a fraction of a second, but I pressed down hard, carving the ink deep into the paper. I set the pen down. It's done. Evelyn organized the documents into a manila envelope. She looked tired. What are you going to do now? She asked. I stood up and buttoned my suit jacket. I felt lighter. The weight of that checkbook was gone. The weight of endless expectation had vanished. I felt a strange, cold clarity. "I'm going home," I said. "I'm going to finish the final polish on that telescope. And then I'm going to wait." "Wait for what?" "The noise," I said. "They asked for peace. But when they get this envelope, they're going to make a lot of noise. And for the first time in my life, I'm not going to do a single thing to stop it." I walked out of the office and didn't look back. I took the elevator down to the garage, sat in my car for a moment, and gripped the steering wheel tightly. I checked my phone. No new messages. Julian was probably still waiting for me to call and say the pump bill was handled. He probably thought I was just throwing a tantrum. He had no idea I had just officially fired him from being my son. I started the engine. The old Honda let out a low hum. It was reliable, sturdy, and never pretended to be a sports car. It was just like me. As I drove out into the bright California sun, I felt a single tear slip down my cheek. I brushed it away angrily. No more tears. Tears are for the helpless. I wasn't helpless anymore. I was the auditor, and I had just cleared the ledger. The next 7 days were the quietest of my life. For the first time in 20 years, my phone didn't ring with an emergency. No panic texts about maxed out credit cards. No complaints about broken kitchen appliances. No guilt trips about how other grandfathers paid for family vacations to the Maldives. Just pure silence, and it felt incredible. I woke up at 6 in the morning, not because I was rushing to an audit site or losing sleep over Julian's finances, but because the rising sun was lighting up the succulents in my backyard. I brewed my coffee. I sat on the porch, watching the steam rise and fade into the cool morning air. I realized that for decades I had been living with a low-level, chronic stress. It was a constant background hum in my mind, always wondering what crisis Julian would create next. Now that hum was gone, I started taking morning walks. I walked down to the pier near the Golden Gate Bridge and watched the fishermen unload their catch, buying fresh Pacific salmon straight from the boats. I cooked dinner for myself, sitting down properly at the dining table instead of eating standing over the sink like a lonely bachelor. I even read a book cover to cover, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. One quote stuck with me: "Control what you can and accept what you cannot with grace." I think Marcus Aurelius would have approved of what I was doing. I was doing what I could to reclaim my remaining dignity. Meanwhile, 100 miles away in Napa Valley, I knew this silence meant something entirely different. To Julian and Chloe, my silence was just a negotiation tactic. They thought I was pouting, sitting in the dark, regretting that I tore up the check, waiting for them to graciously accept an apology. They were probably bragging to their friends about how I was having some senior moment paranoia. They had no idea that a legal document, carried by a professional process server, was moving toward their front door like a slow-moving cruise missile. By Friday afternoon, the silence finally broke. I was in the living room organizing my old vinyl records. I had just put a Dave Brubeck jazz album on the turntable when the phone rang. Mia's picture flashed on the screen. My heart skipped a beat, thinking it was my granddaughter. But then I saw the name underneath. Chloe. I let it ring 3 times. I turned down the volume on the record player, but I didn't turn it off. I wanted that music in the background. It kept me grounded, reminding me that this was my space and I was in control. I slid my finger across the screen. "Hello? Hi, Arthur?" Chloe's voice was high-pitched, filled with forced cheerfulness. It was the tone she used whenever she wanted to buy something luxury. It was the voice of a predator, dressed as a cheerleader. "Hello, Chloe." I didn't ask how she was. I didn't ask where Julian was. I just waited. "So we haven't heard from you all week," she continued, breezing right past the awkwardness. "We were getting a little worried, with your blood pressure and living alone. We just wanted to make sure you're doing okay." "I'm fine," I said. "In fact, my blood pressure numbers have been surprisingly perfect this week." "Oh, that's great. Wonderful. Listen, I'm calling because we're finalizing the plans for Mia's 10th birthday party. Can you believe she's turning 10? Time flies, right?" She paused, waiting for me to sigh sentimentally. I stayed silent. "Anyway," she continued, the cheerfulness starting to sound a bit strained around the edges, "we decided on a Napa Valley country elegance theme this year. We booked the exclusive Equestrian Country Club right next to the Silicon Valley hub. You know, the one with the Michelin star catering? It's going to be absolutely stunning. All her friends from the elite school will be there. That sounds very nice for her, I said calmly. Right. So here's the thing. The deposit for the venue is due today. And since you usually handle the birthday budget as your gift to Mia, the catering invoice needs to be settled upfront too. I just wanted to make sure you had the wire transfer scheduled today. Given how exclusive the venue is, and since we're looking at getting her a thoroughbred pony, we're looking at a budget of about $8,000 this year. $8,000. She tossed the number out as casually as asking a neighbor for a cup of sugar. She completely ignored the fact that 3 days prior, I had thrown her husband out of my house. She took it for granted that their little talk about boundaries didn't apply to my wallet. She assumed that the dad ATM, despite a temporary glitch, was back open for business. I took a sip of my tea. It was Earl Grey, hot and incredibly soothing. I've already taken care of Mia's gift, I said smoothly. The other end of the line went dead silent. Then I heard the faint, rapid clacking of a keyboard in the background. She was checking their joint bank account online. Oh, she said, her voice dropping an octave. I'm looking at the Wells Fargo account, Arthur, and I don't see any transfer. Did you send it to Julian's personal account? You know, we usually pay for family expenses out of the joint one. I didn't transfer it to Julian's account, I said, and I didn't send it to your joint account either. The clacking stopped completely. What do you mean? Did you mail a check? You know how slow the postal system is these days, Arthur? We have to pay the club by 5 o'clock this afternoon, or we lose our slot. I didn't mail a check either, I said. Chloe's patience snapped. The cheerleader mask dropped, revealing the demanding, entitled manager underneath. All right, Arthur, stop playing these mind games. Where is the money you promised for Mia's birthday? Are you really going to punish a helpless 10-year-old girl just because of a petty argument with Julian? That is incredibly low, even for you. I leaned back in my armchair. Dave Brubeck's saxophone solo was reaching its peak. I am not punishing Mia, I said. I gave her the most valuable gift I could offer. This morning I deposited $15,000 into an irrevocable educational trust in her name. Silence, absolute stunned silence. What? She asked, her voice dry. An educational trust, I repeated, enunciating every word. It's a tax-advantaged investment account dedicated strictly to future educational expenses. The money is locked down tightly. It will compound interest until she turns 18. It can only be used for college tuition, books, or vocational training. But that doesn't help us right now, she screamed, her voice cracking, exposing the raw desperation underneath. We need the cash for the party. We've already invited everyone. We promised Mia a luxury equestrian party. Then you should have funded the party yourself, I said. You and Julian both work. You claim to be a lifestyle influencer, and you are the parents. Parents pay for parties. Grandfathers invest in the future. You can't do this, she yelled. We don't just have $8,000 in liquid cash sitting around. We spent our cash on other things. You have to reverse it. Take the money out of that stupid trust and transfer it to us right now. I can't do that, Chloe, I said, my voice hardening. The trust is irrevocable. Even if I wanted to pull it back, I'd face massive tax penalties. But the truth is, I don't want to pull it back. For the first time, I know exactly where my money is going. It's going into Mia's mind, not to party planners, high-end clubs, or your Hermes closet. It is for the girl. You are ruining everything, she screamed hysterically. You're a selfish, bitter old man. I'm going to tell Mia that her grandfather doesn't care about her at all, that he wouldn't even give her a party. I'm going to tell her that you ruined her 10th birthday. Tell her whatever you want, I said. But when she's 18, looking at a debt-free Ivy League diploma, she'll know exactly who cared about her. I'm putting Julian on the phone, she threatened. He'd better save his phone bill, I said. He'll need it to look for a job. What is that supposed to mean? She demanded sharply. It means, Chloe, that in every literal sense the party is over. I hung up the phone. Instead of just pressing the end button, I slammed the device face down onto the table with a sense of finality. My heart was beating a bit faster, but it wasn't out of fear. It was a surge of adrenaline. It was the thrill of a man who had finally stood his ground. I picked up my teacup again. My hand was steady as a rock. $15,000. It was nearly double the amount she had demanded, but it was safe. It was entirely out of their reach. They couldn't squander it on Michelin star sushi or designer handbags. It was a fortress built around my granddaughter's future, and they didn't hold the key. I could picture the scene at their house perfectly. Chloe throwing her phone, Julian pacing frantically across the expensive hardwood floors, running his hands through his hair. They were scrambling. They finally realized that the safety net, which had caught them for a decade, had suddenly vanished into thin air. They would have to cancel the country club reservation and bake a homemade cake in the backyard. To their artificial social media image, it was a tragedy. To a 10-year-old girl, it would probably be a much better party anyway. But the real storm hadn't even hit them yet. Right now, they were only panicking over an $8,000 party bill. They had no idea that on Saturday afternoon, a professional process server would appear at their social gathering with termination notices and eviction orders. They were worried about losing a rented pony. They had no clue they were about to lose the entire winery and the very roof over their heads. I took a deep breath, smelling the aged paper of the old record sleeve and the fresh scent of black tea. This was the smell of freedom. This was the smell of saying no. I picked up the book of meditations again and flipped to the next page. I had an entire peaceful afternoon to enjoy before the real war began over the weekend. For the first time in years, I looked forward to the coming battle because this time I knew the numbers were on my side. Saturday arrived with the kind of bright, intense sunshine that California real estate agents pray for. It was the perfect light for masking a lie. While I sat on my porch 100 miles away in San Francisco, reading philosophy and drinking cheap drip coffee, my son and his wife were in the backyard of the winery I fully funded, hosting the most anticipated social event of their season, a grand autumn grape harvest preview tasting. Of course I wasn't invited. I was the ghost at the feast, an invisible financier needed only when checks had to clear, but whose physical presence was viewed as a liability that lowered the tone of the event. But I didn't need to be there to know exactly what was happening. I knew the layout of that estate villa by heart, and I knew the acoustics of the tasting patio. Besides, through the high-end security system I paid for out of my own pocket, I could have watched the entire live feed on my iPad. But I didn't watch. I didn't need the pixels to know the script. I knew my son, I knew his wife, and I knew that arrogance always inflates to its absolute maximum, right before the needle punctures the balloon. The backyard of Oakmont Winery was designed specifically to inspire envy. Those were the instructions Chloe had given to a top Silicon Valley landscape architect 3 years ago. She didn't want a garden. She wanted a social statement. The fig trees were pruned into flawless geometric shapes, and the drought-resistant turf was maintained to a uniform millimeter. At the center of it all stood Julian, wearing a custom linen apron that read, Vineyard Patriarch. He stood before a $5,000 commercial outdoor gas grill that he had actually only used twice. He was playing the part of the benevolent, highly successful winery owner and family man. He laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, holding the glass of his own estate reserve that he couldn't actually judge by vintage, acting for all the world like a Napa Valley tech money mogul who had conquered the earth. Chloe was holding court near the fire pit. She wore a white leather-paneled linen maxi dress that probably cost more than my very first used car. She was surrounded by her socialite squad, women who all looked vaguely identical, with the same expensive highlights and the same analytical, judgmental eyes. There was Tiffany, whose husband ran a hedge fund in Silicon Valley, and Jessica, who owned a designer boutique that never seemed to actually sell any clothes. They were sipping custom sangria made from an expensive champagne I had bought to celebrate New Year's last year, though I never got a single taste of it myself. I could picture Chloe's voice perfectly in my mind. When she bragged, she used a specific tone, a slightly melodic, breathy register designed entirely to make the listener feel inferior. We're thinking of extending this terrace out further next spring, she would say casually, gesturing toward the flawless Italian tile beneath her feet. Julian and I feel the flow isn't quite seamless yet. We want to put in an outdoor kitchen with a professional pizza oven. You know, that rustic meets modern minimalist vibe. We might have to cut down that old oak tree to make room, but honestly, it drops too many leaves anyway. It's such a hassle, that old oak tree. The tree I planted 30 years ago with my late wife. The tree Julian used to climb constantly when he was 6 years old. To Chloe, it was just a hassle that stood in the way of her pizza oven. Tiffany would nod sympathetically, taking a sip of her drink. I completely understand, Chloe. Renovations are such a nightmare. We just finished the pool house, and I was ready to lose my mind with the contractors. Oh, I know, Chloe would laugh, tossing her hair. But Julian is so wonderful at managing them. He's incredibly demanding, only accepts top-tier craftsmanship. We're actually looking at a winter ski cabin in Aspen next. Nothing massive, just a little getaway for the season. You know, the stress of managing all these properties is real. We need a sanctuary. She would let out a heavy sigh and make a dramatic face, fully designed to win sympathy from the others for her imaginary burden of being too wealthy. Jessica would lean in to interject. Speaking of pressure, where's Julian's dad? I remember he used to always hover around these events. He was always kind of helicoptering over you guys. Chloe would roll her eyes. It was a well-rehearsed gesture, a perfect performance of long-suffering endurance. Oh, Arthur, we finally had to set some strict boundaries. He was just getting to be too much. I mean, in his own way, he means well, I suppose, but he's just so needy. He was always doing these pop-ins, criticizing how we raise Mia, trying to fix things around here that weren't even broken. We had to tell him we need our space. We're focusing on our own nuclear family now. It's just healthier. Good for you, Tiffany would say. Toxic family members will drain every bit of your energy. You have to protect your peace. Exactly. Chloe would raise her glass. To peace, and to not having to sit through another 3-hour story about accounting audits. They would all laugh. It was a cruel, crisp, clinking sound that drifted over the fence and into the neighbor's yard. They were toasting to my absence, celebrating the freedom of spending my money without having to look at my face. Julian would look over from the grill and smile at them. He didn't hear the insult, or maybe he did and chose to ignore it. He was too busy living in his own illusion. In his mind, he was the king of the castle. He was the provider. He was the man who made all this magic happen. He had selectively forgotten that the premium Wagyu beef he was grilling, the propane in the tanks, and every single inch of the ground beneath his feet was fully subsidized by the old man they were laughing at. The party was reaching its peak. The background music was a carefully curated, smooth, yacht rock playlist. The air was filled with the aroma of expensive beef and premium charcoal. Everything was perfect. Everything was under control. Then the sound of reality arrived. It wasn't a subtle sound. It was the intrusion of something that didn't belong in this luxury setting. An unmarked black sedan pulled up outside the estate's wrought iron gates. A burly man in an unassuming gray suit stepped out of the car. He wasn't a delivery driver. He was a professional process server authorized by the California courts. He didn't ring the bell. Instead, he walked right through the unlocked side gate and strode up the gravel driveway, holding a thick, sealed manila envelope. Julian looked up from the grill. He frowned. He wasn't expecting any visitors, and he certainly didn't recognize this man. He wiped his hands on his apron and walked toward him, trying to look casual. But for people who live beyond their means, there is always a low-level anxiety that spikes when an unexpected stranger arrives. He met the man at the edge of the patio. "Are you Julian Vance?" the process server asked, checking a printed photograph in his hand. His voice was loud, entirely indifferent to the social atmosphere of the party. "That's me," Julian said. "Can you keep it down? We have guests." "Are you Julian Vance, Director of Operations for Oakmont Holdings, LLC?" The man confirmed in a flat, clinical tone. "Yes, that's me. What is this about?" "You've been served with legal documents." The man handed over the heavy envelope. Julian hesitated, taking the packet. "What documents?" "You've been served," the man repeated, offering no further explanation. He turned on his heel and walked away, his leather shoes crunching loudly against the gravel. Julian stood there, holding the envelope. He should have taken it inside. He should have waited until the guests left to open it. But curiosity is dangerous, and deep down, fear is always stronger than curiosity. He looked at the return address, Hayes and Associates, Corporate Law, San Francisco. Julian's heart must have skipped a beat right then. He knew Evelyn Hayes. He knew she was my most trusted, iron-fisted attorney. He probably thought it was a check. He likely assumed I had come to my senses, realized I was being petty about the water pump bill, and sent a cashier's check through my lawyer to save face. A faint smile even appeared at the corner of his mouth. He thought he had won. He turned his back to the guests, using his body to shield the envelope. He tore open the seal and pulled out the documents. There were 3 separate notices. The first was not a check. It was a formal letter printed on heavy cream letterhead. At the top, printed in bold capital letters, were words that instantly changed the atmospheric pressure of the entire afternoon. Notice of termination and notice to quit. Julian blinked. He read it again. His brain couldn't process the words. A notice to quit? An eviction? That was something landlords gave to people who couldn't pay rent. That absolutely could not happen to him, the chief operating officer of Oakmont Winery, the man with the $5,000 grill. He read down through the first paragraph. Dear Mr. Vance, please be advised that pursuant to Section 7 of the Operating Agreement of Oakmont Holdings, LLC, the controlling member, Mr. Arthur Vance, hereby terminates your employment as Director of Operations effective immediately. Furthermore, as your occupancy of the property, located at 2445 Oakmont Avenue, Napa Valley, is strictly contingent upon said employment, your residency rights are hereby revoked. You and your dependents are required to vacate the premises and surrender possession of the property to Arthur Vance within 30 days of receipt of this notice. Failure to vacate will result in the immediate filing of an unlawful detainer action. The color began to drain from Julian's face. It didn't happen all at once. It started at his lips, which turned a pale, muted gray, and then quickly spread to his cheeks. His hands began to shake. The paper rattled in the light breeze. He quickly flipped to the second document. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe it was a bad joke. The second notice was even more absolute than the first. Notice of intent to liquidate assets. This is to inform you that the aforementioned estate and winery assets will be placed on the open market for liquidation. A professional asset auditor and real estate photographer will arrive this coming Monday at 9 a.m. to perform an inventory and visual documentation of the interior, exterior, and wine cellar stock. As the current temporary occupant, you are legally required to maintain the property in show-ready condition and allow potential buyers access with 24 hours notice. Liquidation, sale. The words hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. We were selling the winery, his winery, the home where he had just told his friends he was going to expand the pizza oven, the estate he was using to celebrate his own success. Trembling, he looked at the third document. It was a copy of the promissory note, the $50,000 they borrowed 2 years ago to build Chloe's luxurious influencer tasting room. Stamped across the front in stark red ink was a single word: default, call in full. Julian felt the entire world tilting beneath him. The smell of the premium Wagyu burgers suddenly made him nauseous. The laughter of his guests sounded distorted, like he was listening to them underwater. He looked around the yard. He saw Tiffany admiring the fig trees. He saw Jessica refilling her sangria. He looked at this luxurious illusion he had painstakingly maintained. He saw a bulldozer moving in, ready to grind it all into dust. 30 days. He couldn't survive 30 days. He didn't even have $30 of disposable cash. His credit cards were completely maxed out. He had 0 savings. He had a vain wife who was expecting a ski cabin in Aspen. And now he was holding a letter, telling him he was about to be an unemployed, displaced person. Just then, Chloe's voice broke through the fog of his panic. "Honey, who was that?" Julian jumped, startled. He scrambled to shove the documents back into the torn envelope, then jammed it deep into the large pocket of his apron. The envelope didn't fit completely. The stiff corners jutted out awkwardly against the fabric, looking incredibly obvious and threatening. He turned around. He tried to smile, but it was a bizarre, strained expression. His eyes were wide with terror, but his mouth was forced into a wide, unnatural grin. Oh, just a local courier deliver, he stammered. His voice was an octave higher than usual. Chloe walked toward him. She looked a bit annoyed that Julian had left the grill to handle mundane chores. Obviously, it was a courier, Julian. What's inside? Is it the exclusive wine supply contract for that national restaurant group? Did you finally sign the big deal? She was throwing him a lifeline. She wanted to show off in front of her friends, so she served a ready-made lie to him on a silver platter. She expected him to say yes. She wanted to turn to Tiffany and Jessica and say, "See? My husband signs million-dollar contracts even on weekends." Julian looked at her. He looked at the expectant faces of the guests. He looked at the lie he had depended on for his entire existence, and in total desperation he doubled down. "Yeah," his voice broke, a desperate rasp tearing through his throat. "Yeah, that's exactly what it is. The contract for the big account. They just needed my signature. Huge deal. Very time sensitive." Chloe practically radiated triumph. She clapped her hands together. "I told you guys!" she shrieked, turning back to her friends. "He's completely unstoppable. We are absolutely celebrating tonight. Champagne is on us." The guests cheered. Tiffany raised her glass high. "To Julian, Napa Valley's ultimate rainmaker." Julian gave a weak, hollow nod. "To me," he muttered under his breath. He turned back to the grill and picked up his spatula. His hand was shaking so violently he nearly dropped it straight into the fire. He stared blankly at the burger patties. They were burning now, the melting fat dripping onto the hot coals and triggering sharp bursts of orange flame. He watched the premium beef turn to black ash, feeling a distinct sensation that his own life was burning right along with it. Through the thin fabric of his apron, he could feel the envelope pressed tight against his thigh. It felt blazing hot, like a radioactive isotope burning through his skin. 30 days. He looked over at Chloe, who was laughing hysterically at a joke Jessica had just made. She was completely oblivious. She was still planning pizza ovens and ski trips. She had no idea the very ground beneath her designer heels had just been put up for sale. She didn't know her husband wasn't a rainmaker, he was just a squatter in a house of cards. A wave of intense dizziness washed over Julian. He gripped the handle of the grill to steady himself. He needed a drink, something heavy, something strong. But he couldn't leave. He was the host. He had to stand there, grilling expensive beef for people he didn't even like, all while his entire reality dissolved inside his pocket. The sun beat down mercilessly, competing with the heat radiating from the grill. He was drenched in sweat now, the salt stinging his eyes. "Are you okay, babe?" Chloe called out from across the lawn. "You look really flushed." "I'm fine," Julian choked out, his voice hoarse. "Just, the fire is hot." It wasn't the fire from the grill. It was the heat of the hell he had just personally invited himself into. And for him, the worst part wasn't the sudden fear of being displaced, or even the looming threat of financial ruin. The worst part was the suffocating, crushing weight of the secret. He had to survive the rest of this party. He had to keep smiling. He had to keep serving burgers. He had to keep pretending. I could almost pity him, almost. But then I remembered the text. "We need boundaries." "Well, son," I thought to myself as I turned the page of my book on the porch, "enjoy your party. Because tomorrow, your version of peace ends, and the real audit begins." The process server was long gone, but the destruction was already locked in. The first domino had fallen, and Julian, standing there in his ridiculous apron, was the only one who could hear the chain reaction of the remaining pieces clicking into place. It was just past 11 in the evening when the harsh sweep of headlights cut across my living room wall. I was sitting in my leather armchair. The main lights were off, with only a small reading lamp illuminating the pages on my lap. Outside, a severe storm rolling in from the Pacific coast had finally arrived, driving a torrential downpour that whipped against the windows. Thunder rumbled in the distance, but it was completely drowned out by the aggressive roar of an SUV engine gunning down my driveway. I didn't need to look out the window to know who it was. I knew the specific violent rumble of that Range Rover. I knew the sound of the car door slamming, not a casual click, but a heavy echoing thud loaded with pure rage. I closed my book and set it down gently on the side table next to my cold tea. I didn't get up, and I didn't walk to the door. I just sat there, waiting. I wanted them to come to me. I wanted them to cross the threshold into my space, bringing their chaos and desperation into the light, so I could dismantle it piece by piece, the exact same way I would dissect a fraudulent financial ledger. A second later, the pounding began. It wasn't a knock. It was a physical assault on the wood. Thud, thud, thud. "Open up!" Julian's voice shouted, raw and cracking against the wind and rain. "Open this door right now, Dad!" I took a deep breath, smoothed the creases on my trousers, and stood up. Slowly, with deliberate calm, I walked into the foyer. I turned the deadbolt. I didn't throw the door wide open. I simply turned the handle and pulled it back just enough to reveal them. They looked like a walking tragedy. Julian was completely drenched. His expensive custom shirt stuck to his chest, translucent and ruined. The hair he usually styled so meticulously was matted down, water dripping into his eyes. Chloe stood right behind him, shivering violently in her thin linen dress, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest. Her mascara had completely run in the downpour, leaving jagged black streaks down her cheeks like a broken doll. They didn't wait for an invitation. Julian shoved past me roughly, his shoulder hitting mine hard enough to force me back a step. Chloe followed instantly, bringing a draft of cold, damp air into the house, a heavy mix of ozone and expensive perfume gone sour. "You're insane!" Julian roared, spinning around to face me. Water from his hair sprayed onto my hardwood floor. "You are legally completely out of your mind. Do you have any idea what you did today? Do you have any clue what you've done?" I calmly closed the door behind them and threw the deadbolt back into place. The sharp click of the metal lock sounded incredibly loud in the sudden silence of the entryway. "I know exactly what I did," I said. My voice was low, the precise tone an auditor uses when explaining to a board of directors why a fraudulent account must be closed. "I issued a formal legal notice. I assume you received it." "Received it?" Chloe shrieked, stepping out from behind Julian, her eyes wide with frantic energy. "Received it?" A process server handed it to my husband in the middle of our party. In front of everyone, in front of Tiffany, in front of Jessica. We were humiliated, Arthur, utterly humiliated. She was shaking all over, not from the cold, but from the raw fury of an entitled person suddenly being handed the bill. "We had to kick everyone out," Julian shouted, pacing frantically back and forth in the foyer, his wet leather shoes squeaking loudly against the floor. "We had to make up some stupid lie that I got sudden food poisoning. Do you know how embarrassing that was? I looked like a complete idiot. And then I opened the envelope and see this garbage." He reached into his soaked pocket, pulled out the crumpled, water-stained legal documents, and threw them violently at me. They drifted through the air like wet leaves, landing limply on the floor between us. "A notice to vacate," he spat, clenching his teeth. "Are you kidding me? You can't evict us, Dad. We're family. You can't treat us like tenants." I looked down at the documents on the floor, but didn't bother to pick them up. "I am treating you exactly like tenants," I said, "because that is precisely what you are. And bad ones at that. The kind who damage the property, disrespect the owner, and refuse to pay rent." "That is our house," Chloe screamed, stepping right into my face. I could see the veins pulsing in her neck. "How dare you call yourself a landlord? We live there. We turned that place into a real home. I personally painted the nursery. I picked out the kitchen backsplash. I planted those fig trees. That makes it our property." I looked at her. I looked at the absolute delusion in her eyes. She genuinely believed that choosing a paint color at a hardware store automatically transferred the legal title of a $2 million asset. "Chloe," I said, putting my hands behind my back and keeping my voice level, "painting a wall doesn't hand you a deed, and picking a backsplash doesn't mean you signed a mortgage. You have lived there rent-free for 5 years. It was a gift, a privilege, and today that privilege expired." "You can't do this," Julian interrupted, his voice shaking. "The law won't let you. We have rights. We have squatters' rights or a tenancy by estoppel. You can't just throw a family out onto the street." I almost laughed. Squatters' rights. He was desperately grasping at legal terms he'd probably overheard on a cheap television drama. "I suggest you read those papers again," I said. Those aren't my words. Those were drafted by Evelyn Hayes. You know Evelyn. She doesn't make mistakes. The property is owned 100% by Oakmont Holdings, LLC. I am the sole controlling member. Your occupancy was tied entirely to your employment at the winery. And the operating agreement clearly states that the controlling member can terminate that arrangement at any time if an employee's conduct acts against the best interests of the company. Against the best interests? Julian yelled. What did we do? What did we possibly do that was so harmful? We are raising your granddaughter. We are living our lives. You demanded money I don't owe you, I said. You disrespected me in the home I fully fund. You told me to stay away from your lives. You told me, explicitly, that you wanted peace. Well, Julian, this is what peace looks like. Peace is me protecting my assets from a family that treats me like an open checkbook. This is all over the water pump money, isn't it? Chloe hissed like a viper, rudely wiping away the running mascara from her cheeks with the back of her hand. All of this because Julian asked you to cover a necessary repair. Oh my God, you are so incredibly petty. You are a small, vindictive, lonely old man who is doing all of this just to teach us a lesson? Fine. Message received. We will pay for the stupid pump ourselves. Now, call your lawyer and call off the eviction. She looked at me with an expression full of expectation. She still thought this was a negotiation. She thought she could just throw a few $1,000s at the problem to make it disappear, exactly the way things used to work. This has nothing to do with the pump money, I said. The pump was just the finger pulling the trigger. The gun itself has been loaded for years. I walked past them and stepped into the living room. I needed space. The heavy scent of unearned entitlement radiating off them was suffocating. Where do you think you're going? Julian shouted, following close behind me. Don't turn your back on me. We are not finished here. I turned around to face him by the fireplace. We are finished, Julian. The notice gives you 30 days. As of right now, you have 29 left. I strongly suggest you spend less time yelling in my entryway and more time online looking for an apartment you can actually afford. He collapsed onto the sofa, my leather sofa. He buried his face in his damp hands, looking incredibly small. He looked just like the 6-year-old boy who used to break windows with baseballs and run to me, fully expecting me to patch everything up. But I wasn't the repairman anymore. I was the demolition crew. Dad, please, he choked out, his shoulders shaking as he began to sob. You can't do this to Mia. She loves her room. She loves the stables. If we have to move, she'll have to change schools. She'll lose all her friends. Do you really want to hurt your own granddaughter? Is that what you want? Using the child as a human shield. I knew that card was coming. It was their ultimate fallback strategy. Mia will be fine, I said. My voice remained completely flat, even though the mention of her name caused a sharp pang in my chest. Mia is resilient. What Mia truly needs isn't a luxury bedroom or an elite private school, funded by her grandfather's accounts. Mia needs to see her father stand on his own 2 feet. She needs to see her parents struggle and survive, rather than rely on extraction and blackmail. You are destroying her life, Chloe screamed. She rushed into the living room, shielding Julian like a wild animal cornered in its den. You are a monster. You're envious of us. You're envious because we're young and happy and you're just old and alone. That's what this is. You want us to be just as miserable as you are. I looked at both of them, young and happy. They were living a nightmare. They were drowning in debt, maintaining a ridiculous facade for people who didn't care about them, terrified of a future they were completely unprepared to face. I'm not miserable, Chloe, I said. I'm free. And very soon you will be free too. Free from the crushing weight of a property you can't afford, and free from the illusion that you are wealthy. It's going to be difficult, and it's going to be incredibly painful, but it might just save your lives. Save us? Julian looked up, his eyes bloodshot and wide. You're ruining us. If I have an eviction and a civil judgment on my public record, any background check will completely destroy my reputation. Dad, my entire career in this industry relies on status. If my credit is ruined, I won't even be able to land a job. Then you'd better start packing your bags right now, I said, because the clock is ticking. He stood up, The sadness in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, rigid fury. It was the anger of a spoiled, privileged child, realizing the world would no longer bend to his will. "Fine," he sneered. "You want a war? You got it. We are not moving out. We're going to fight this. We will stay in that house and force you to drag us out. We can tie this up in court for months. I just looked it up online, Dad, in California. Legally evicting a family with a minor child takes at least 6 months. And during those months, you won't see Mia a single time. Not once. You are dead to her." I nodded slowly. I had already anticipated this move. "You can certainly try," I said softly. "But remember who pays the legal fees. I retain Evelyn Hayes. I have the resources to tie this up in court for a decade. What about you? Can you afford a massive retainer for a defense attorney? Can you cover the filing fees? Or are you going to ask Tiffany and Jessica to fund your lawsuit?" Julian visibly flinched as if he had been struck. "And as for Mia," I continued, dropping my voice to a dangerous whisper, "if you dare use that little girl as a chess piece, or if you attempt to block me from seeing her, I will go straight to family court and file for grandparents' rights. Furthermore, I will present your true financial ledger to the judge. I will prove in open court that your household is entirely unstable, near bankruptcy, and facing imminent displacement. Who do you think the judge will side with? A well-funded grandfather with a dedicated trust, or an unemployed father with maxed-out credit cards?" "Unemployed?" Julian frowned, trying to push back. "I am not unemployed. I am the director of operations for Oakmont Winery." I looked at him with pure pity. "Be sure to meet the corporate auditor at the winery on Monday morning, son." "What? What did you do?" He took a step forward, panic rising in his voice once again. "You aren't a partner, Julian," I said. "I am the sole director and owner of that LLC. It's my capital. I terminated your employment contract on Friday. The liquidation process officially begins Monday morning." He stared at me, his anger melting into pure despair. He looked like a man watching the ground split open right beneath his feet. You fired me." "I didn't fire you," I corrected. "I just stopped paying you to pretend to work. There's a difference. If you're truly as exceptional as you claim, and if you're really a rainmaker, another wine label will snatch you up in no time, right?" He didn't answer. He knew the truth. He knew he was utterly mediocre. He knew the only reason he ever held that title was because I signed a piece of paper 5 years ago. "Get out," I said. Neither of them moved. "Get out of my house," I barked. It was the first time I had raised my voice all night. The sound echoed off the walls, making them both jump. Chloe grabbed Julian's arm tightly. "Let's go," she said, her voice trembling. "Let's go. He's crazy. He's completely lost it. We'll find the best attorney in the city tomorrow morning and hold him accountable for this." She dragged him toward the door. Julian stumbled along, looking back at me one last time. The way he looked at me made it feel like I was a complete stranger. "I hate you," he whispered fiercely. "I know," I said. They walked out into the pouring rain. This time the door wasn't slammed shut. It didn't rattle. I walked over, closed it firmly, and threw the deadbolt. Click. I rested my forehead against the cool wood of the door. My heart was hammering like a sledgehammer against my ribs, and my hands were shaking. I wasn't born to do things like this. I am an accountant, a builder. My entire life's work has been about balancing sheets and fixing errors, not tearing things apart. But sometimes, to fix a foundation that has rotted through to its core, you have to level the entire structure. I turned off the porch light and walked back to my chair. The tea was entirely cold. The book remained open to the exact same page. The silence returned to the townhouse, but it felt entirely different now. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of the morning. It was the heavy, smoky stillness of a battlefield after the first devastating exchange of artillery. They were gone, but the real war had only just begun. I took a sip of the cold tea. It tasted incredibly bitter. "Good," I whispered to the empty room. I sat in the dark, listening to the rain wash away the tire tracks in the driveway. 100 miles away, my son and his wife were driving back to a house that no longer belonged to them, to sleep in a bed they didn't own, preparing to wake up to a desperate future they never saw coming. Monday was going to be a very long day. Monday morning arrived like a judge's gavel coming down in a courtroom. It was sharp, decisive, and demanded absolute order. As I sat in my kitchen in San Francisco, sipping fresh coffee and watching the rain streak down the windows, two parallel disasters were unfolding simultaneously in Napa Valley. I wasn't physically present, but I knew the exact timeline. I knew it because I had mapped it out myself. At 8:55 a.m. at the Oakmont estate, Chloe was frantically scrubbing a red wine stain off the white marble countertop with a sponge. She looked like a woman on the verge of a total psychological break. She was still in her expensive silk pajamas, her hair thrown into a messy knot, muttering nervously to herself. The house that used to be her ultimate fortress of social status now felt like a prison cell that was shrinking by the minute. She had completely ignored the confirmation emails from the real estate agency. She deleted the photographer's voicemails. She tried to convince herself through sheer denial that if she didn't acknowledge the appointment, it simply wouldn't happen. She believed she could lock herself away from reality. But denial doesn't work on electronic keypad locks. Right at 9 a.m., a black Mercedes sedan pulled into the driveway. A woman in a tailored navy blazer stepped out of the vehicle. This wasn't just any real estate agent. This was Courtney, a woman Chloe had known since college. A woman Chloe had spent the last 5 years trying to completely outshine in social status. Her old rival who had lost to Chloe in the sorority elections years ago. And now Courtney held the master key to the entire state. When Chloe saw Courtney through the kitchen window, she froze. The sponge slipped from her hand and hit the floor. She watched in absolute paralysis as Courtney walked up the path with a brisk, professional stride, followed by a photographer carrying a heavy gear bag and a tripod. The doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the empty estate like a formal summons to court. Chloe didn't open the door. She took a few steps back, holding her breath. Then came the sound of the electronic keypad. Beep, 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 click. The front door swung open. "Hello?" Courtney's voice drifted in, cheerful and sharp with professional enthusiasm. "Listing agent is here. We have an appointment for the photo shoot." Chloe rushed into the hallway, clutching the collar of her robe tightly. "You can't come in here," she shrieked. "Get out! This is private property." Courtney stopped in her tracks. She looked Chloe up and down, taking in the wine-stained robe, the frantic eyes, and the heavy scent of bleach and panic hanging in the air. A slow, pitying, vicious smile spread across her face. "Chloe," she said smoothly, "I had no idea you were home. The trustee, Mr. Vance, assured me the property would be vacant for the shoot. But since you're here, do you think you could move that pile of clothes off the sofa? We need a clear, ultra-wide shot of the living room." While Chloe was facing the mocking smirk of her college rival, across the estate grounds in the glass-walled office building of the Winery, Julian was striding toward his office. He looked terrible. He hadn't slept all weekend. His eyes were bloodshot, and he had a tiny nick on his chin from a shaky shave. But he had forced himself into his finest custom suit, desperately trying to project an illusion of stability and control. He kept telling himself that the weekend was just a nightmare, that his father was only bluffing. His father always compromised in the end. Julian reached his office door and grabbed the handle. It was locked. He frowned, tapping his employee ID badge against the scanner. The light flashed red. "Access denied." He swiped it again. Red. "Access denied." "Hey, Sarah," he called out to his assistant at her desk 10 feet away. "My card got demagnetized. Can you buzz me in?" Sarah didn't stand up. She looked at him with an expression of intense, agonizing discomfort. "I can't do that, Julian," she whispered. "Mr. Harris, the auditor, needs to see you in the boardroom right now." Back at the villa, the invasion was in full swing. The photographer was setting up cold studio lights in the living room, casually tossing aside the expensive throw pillows Chloe had painstakingly sourced. Flashes of light strobed repeatedly, documenting every corner of the space she had once claimed was the masterpiece of her life's work. Chloe stood in the kitchen, cornered by Courtney. "You can't do this, Courtney," Chloe spat through clenched teeth. "We are not selling this house. My father-in-law is having a mental health crisis. He's experiencing cognitive decline. Our lawyers are clearing up this absurdity today. You need to leave right now." Courtney opened the folder she had been holding and slid out a piece of paper. "This doesn't look like cognitive decline to me, Chloe," Courtney said, tapping the document with a perfectly manicured French tip nail. "I have an exclusive listing agreement signed by the sole controlling member, Arthur Vance, and I also have a copy of the notice to vacate that was formally served to you on Saturday." She looked up, her eyes gleaming with absolute malicious delight. "Honestly, it's just so sad," she continued in a conversational tone. "Everyone in our circle thought you guys actually bought this place. You always talked about my kitchen and my private garden. But it turns out you were just parasites living in employee housing. This must be incredibly embarrassing for you." "It's our house," Chloe snapped, unraveling. "We are the beneficiaries of the family business." "Were," Courtney corrected cruelly, shifting the tense. "The listing entry specifies a direct sale by the controlling member with vacant possession. That means you have to go." Courtney glanced around the kitchen, running a finger along the marble island. "The luxury market is a bit soft right now," she mused with fake regret. "But since this is an aggressive forced liquidation, we've priced it to sell. Actually, a buyer is arriving in 20 minutes. He invests in short-term rental properties. Maybe you can try to rent it back from him. Though looking at your credit score, he probably wouldn't approve you." Chloe felt tears sting her eyes. She wanted to scream. She wanted to slap the smug look off Courtney's face. But she couldn't, because Courtney had the legal paperwork. Courtney held the power. And Chloe was just a woman standing in her pajamas, shivering in a house that was being sold right out from under her feet. Meanwhile, in the winery boardroom, the air conditioning hummed softly, but Julian was breaking into a cold sweat. He sat at the long mahogany conference table. In the center chair sat a stone-faced stranger in a gray suit. This was Harris, a top independent liquidation and forensic audit specialist from San Francisco. "Julian," Harris said, not even looking up as he flipped through the file in front of him, "the company is undergoing some fundamental restructuring." Julian let out a dry, nervous laugh. "Restructuring sounds intense. But hey, I have great news regarding our distribution network for next quarter. I think I can squeeze another 5% margin out of a few luxury restaurants." Harris finally looked up. His eyes were like ice. "You're not listening, Julian. We are restructuring. Specifically, we are liquidating the company and terminating your position." Julian froze, the smile hardening on his face. "Liquidating? What do you mean? I am the director of operations. I am the face of this brand. I bring in the high-end clients. You can't liquidate me." "You were a figurehead for a specific stream of capital," Harris said flatly. He slid a document across the table. Julian looked down. It was a formal notice of capital withdrawal and account freezing from the parent company. For 5 years, this parent company had been quietly injecting funds to cover the winery's losses, paying the staff, the heavy marketing costs, and Julian's $12,000 monthly salary. "We received this document on Friday," Harris explained. "Our sole investor exercised his absolute authority to pull all operational funding. The reason cited: total loss of confidence in management, more specifically, in you." "In me?" Julian stammered. "Who is the investor? I'll speak to them myself. I can handle this. My public relations skills can win anyone over. Who is it? An investment group in New York?" Harris shook his head. He turned the final page of the file around so Julian could see the signature at the bottom. It wasn't a corporate stamp. It was a handwritten signature in black ink. A signature Julian had seen on his college transcripts, his car insurance policies, and countless life-saving checks over the years. Arthur Vance. Julian stared at the name. The letters seemed to warp and twist before his eyes. "My dad?" he whispered. "My dad is the investor? He controls the entire winery?" 100% absolute control," Harris confirmed. "When he established this LLC 5 years ago, he included a stipulation that his continued funding was contingent upon your full-time employment. He wanted to give you an opportunity to prove yourself. And now?" Julian's voice was barely audible. Harris closed the folder. "Now he says the experiment is over. He has withdrawn his capital, effective immediately. And with all funding channels cut, the corporate accounts have been frozen. We cannot cover your salary, your expense reports, or the operations of your so-called brand PR department. But, but I'm good at this job. Julian stood up, desperate. I built the network. Harris sighed. He took off his glasses and wiped them with a cloth. Let's be completely honest, Julian. Your job was spending money. You took clients to Michelin-star dinners and played golf. The actual winemaking, vineyard maintenance, supply chain logistics, even the tax compliance, that was handled by outsourced professional teams. You were just a storefront paid for by your father, and now the checks have stopped. Harris pressed the intercom button. Security, please step into the boardroom. Julian felt the strength drain from his legs. He collapsed heavily back into his chair. He fired me, he muttered as if his soul had left his body. My own father fired me. He didn't fire you, Harris corrected precisely. He just stopped paying us to keep you. Back at the Oakmont estate, the doorbell rang again. Courtney checked her luxury watch. Perfect timing, she chirped happily. The buyer's here. Chloe, you might want to hide upstairs. It's never a good look for a buyer to see the current occupant, especially dressed like that. Chloe stood frozen for a second, shaking with pure rage. Get out, she hissed under her breath. Courtney ignored her entirely. She strode to the door and threw it wide open. Welcome. Come on in. The natural light right now is absolutely flawless. A man in a cheap suit carrying a clipboard walked in. He looked around the entryway with an incredibly critical eye. Nice floors, the man said. Are they real hardwood or engineered plank? That is premium oak imported from Italy, Chloe shrieked hysterically from the kitchen. She couldn't control herself. The man jumped, looking at her in surprise. Oh, I thought this house was already vacant. It will be very soon, Courtney assured him. Don't mind her, she's packing up to leave. Chloe watched in absolute horror as they walked right into the living room. Courtney was busy pointing out the marble fireplace, the high ceilings, and the custom molding. She was slicing Chloe's entire life into pieces, selling it off to a complete stranger who looked at the house like he was examining a piece of meat. And then the ultimate violation happened. Let's check out the primary suite, Courtney said, guiding the man toward the stairs. The walk-in closet up there will absolutely blow you away. No, Chloe yelled, rushing to the bottom of the staircase to block their path. You cannot go up there. My laundry is all over the floor. The bed isn't even made. Courtney stopped on the third step. She looked down at Chloe. The malicious amusement had vanished from her face, replaced by a cold, hard dose of reality. Then you should have cleaned it up earlier, Courtney said flatly. But since you didn't, we're going up to look anyway. Because you've lost the right to make the rules around here, Chloe. You are just an unwanted guest overstaying your welcome. She turned and continued up the stairs, the man following close behind. Chloe listened to their footsteps pressing into the plush carpet. She heard the creak of the door to her sacred sanctuary being pushed open. She heard the man complain, Wow, it smells a little musty up here, doesn't it? Utterly broken, Chloe collapsed onto the bottom step. She buried her face in her knees. She listened to the relentless clicking of the camera shutter from upstairs, capturing the ruins of her life, getting it ready to be displayed to the entire internet. At that exact microsecond, 2 security guards stepped into the winery boardroom. Mr. Vance, one of the guards said, handing over a cardboard banker's box. We've cleared out your desk. It contains only your personal belongings. The company-issued laptop and phone have been reclaimed. Julian looked inside the box. It was tiny. There was only a picture frame holding a photo of him and Chloe skiing in Aspen, a squished stress ball, and a half-empty bottle of Tom Ford cologne. 5 years of his professional identity, compressed into a cardboard box that weighed less than 5 pounds. You can't do this, Julian said weakly. I need to call my dad. You're welcome to use the payphone in the main lobby, Harris said, standing up. Please escort Mr. Vance from the premises and deactivate his keycard. A guard stepped forward, moving with practiced efficiency as he unclipped the badge from Julian's belt loop. Julian felt a slight tug at his waist, and just like that, his final lifeline to this world was severed. He wasn't the chief operating officer anymore. He was just a guy in a suit holding a cardboard box. He stood up and walked toward the door. He turned back to look at Harris. Tell him, Julian spat through clenched teeth. Tell him he ruined my life. Harris looked down at the liquidation schedule in his hands, never even raising his head. I believe that is the exact message he was trying to send to you, Mr. Vance. Julian stepped out into the hallway. The walk to the elevators felt like a public execution. The employees who used to bow and scrape before him were watching. They were whispering. They already knew. Gossip in an office travels faster than light. The prince had been deposed. The safety net was gone. The elevator ride down took exactly 30 seconds. 30 seconds to fall from the clouds to the asphalt. 30 seconds to go from the top of the world to an outcast on the street. When the elevator doors slid open in the lobby, the harsh, clinical light of the real world hit him. It was still pouring outside. He didn't have an umbrella. He stepped onto the sidewalk, clutching the cardboard box. The rain instantly soaked through his custom suit, ruining his styled hair and running down his neck. Standing on the street corner, he pulled out his personal phone and dialed my number. I sat in my kitchen watching the screen flash with the name Julian. I didn't pick up. I just let it ring. I watched the rain fall on my garden, and my mind drifted back to the first time I taught Julian to ride a bicycle. I let go of the seat, and the bike began to wobble. He was terrified, screaming for me to catch him, but I knew that if I never let go, he would never learn to balance. So I watched him fall. He scraped his knee, and he cried. But the next day, he learned how to ride. This fall was infinitely more brutal, and the injury would run much deeper. The phone stopped ringing. A minute later, it started again. This time, it was Chloe. I didn't answer that one either. I pictured them in my mind. Julian standing drenched on a street corner, stripped of his title. Chloe collapsed on a staircase, stripped of her pride. Two halves of a perfect illusion, shattered at the exact same time. I took a sip of my coffee. It was still warm. I picked up my pen and a notepad. There was a long list of action items in front of me. Cancel joint car lease, cosign, done. Deactivate country club family cards, done. Freeze corporate accounts, done. Execute property listing photo shoot, done. I didn't do this out of hatred. I did it out of absolute necessity. This was a major surgical extraction of a tumor, and surgery always involves a little blood. I took one final look at my phone. "Welcome to the real world, kids," I whispered. Then I turned the ringer off, picked up my book, and lost myself in the pages. The house filled with an absolute, profound silence, and for the first time in decades, that silence felt exactly like justice. The conference room at Hayes & Associates was specifically engineered to psychologically flatten an opponent. Located on the 42nd floor of a sleek tower in San Francisco's financial district, the panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows offered a staggering view of the skyline, a city I had spent decades auditing and restructuring. But inside, the air was suffocating. The climate control system hummed with a low, heavy pressure. The long mahogany table was polished to a mirror-like finish, reflecting the strained, distorted faces of everyone seated around it. On one side of the table sat my son, Julian, and his wife, Chloe. In just 48 hours, they looked like they had aged a decade. Julian wore a rumpled suit, his collar unbuttoned and his tie loosened. He couldn't bring himself to look at me, keeping his eyes locked onto his own tightly locked hands on the table, his knuckles white from the pressure. Chloe wore an oversized pair of black sunglasses even indoors. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, radiating a volatile mix of pure fury and absolute terror. Seated next to them was their attorney, a man named Marshall. I knew Marshall's reputation. He was a flashy Los Angeles lawyer who mostly handled high-profile celebrity divorces, relying heavily on media posturing but completely out of his depth in a hardcore corporate environment. Crucially, his retainer could be paid in installments, a detail that told me everything I needed to know about the current state of my son's finances. On the other side of the table sat Evelyn Hayes and myself. Evelyn was the definition of lethal elegance. A thick black binder rested unopened before her, her hands resting calmly on top of it, projecting absolute dominance. I sat beside her, silent, staring coldly out the window at the storm clouds rolling over the bay. Marshall cleared his throat, a sound heavy with manufactured confidence. "Let's not waste each other's time." he began, trying to sound authoritative. My clients are the victims of a sudden bad faith eviction and a wrongful termination. Mr. Vance, even though you are Julian's father, your actions demonstrate extreme prejudice. We are prepared to argue for a constructive trust and equitable interest. Julian and Chloe lived on that estate for 5 years. They operated it as their own asset. They put their blood, sweat, and tears into that property and that wine label. You cannot simply wipe out a family business because of a domestic dispute. He leaned back, looking entirely satisfied with his opening performance. Evelyn didn't even blink. She didn't look at Marshall. She looked directly at Julian. Blood, sweat, and tears, Evelyn repeated softly. That's wonderfully poetic imagery, Mr. Marshall. But in this room, we are forensic accountants. We only recognize receipts. She unclipped the binder. The sharp pop of the metal rings sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Chloe ripped off her sunglasses, her eyes swollen and bloodshot from sleepless nights. We renovated that tasting room, she spat, her voice sharp and brittle. I told you, I didn't just put in Italian marble. I built the entire brand matrix on social media. That dramatically increased the valuation of the asset. That creates an implied partnership under the law. Evelyn flipped to the first page, her fingers sliding down rows of dense data. Let's talk about valuation, she said, and let's talk about who actually paid for that value. She pulled out a massive spreadsheet covered in colored charts. This is the financial autopsy of their lifestyle. Exhibit A, Evelyn said, sliding a copy of the spreadsheet across the polished wood toward Marshall. This is the master ledger for all combined expenditures on the Oakmont property and winery operations over the past 60 months. Marshall picked up the paper, his brow furrowing instantly. Evelyn began to read. Her voice carried no emotion, sounding like a precision machine liquidating a bankruptcy estate. Monthly mortgage principal and interest on the estate, $14,500, paid entirely by Arthur Vance through a holding company. 5-year total, $870,000. She looked up. Julian, did you contribute a single dollar to that? Julian gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head. No, property taxes, Evelyn continued. California state and local supplementary assessments, averaging $32,000 annually. Paid by Arthur Vance. 5-year total, $160,000. Chloe shifted uncomfortably in her chair. That's completely normal. Wealthy parents support their children's business ventures all the time. Evelyn ignored her entirely. Commercial liability insurance, earthquake insurance, fire insurance, paid in full by Arthur Vance. Total, $45,000. She turned a page. The crisp sound of paper was the only noise in the dead silent room. Facility maintenance and repair costs, Evelyn continued. A brand new commercial HVAC system installed in 2021, costing $24,000. Roof restoration in 2022, costing $15,000. Weekly landscaping, monthly pool cleaning, pest control, high-end security monitoring, all billed directly to Arthur Vance. She paused, looking dead into Chloe's eyes. You mentioned the fig tree garden outside the tasting room earlier, Chloe. According to this invoice from Greenleaf Landscaping, the installation and cultivation cost was $12,000. The check was cut by Arthur Vance. You didn't plant a single thing. You pointed at a photo in a luxury lifestyle magazine, said, I want that, and my client wrote a check. Chloe's face flushed an ugly dark shade of crimson. But I provided the design concept, she stammered. I chose the color palette. That's intellectual property. Evelyn didn't waste a single word refuting her. She flipped another page. Now let's address this claim of sweat equity regarding the marble renovations in the tasting room. You claim you paid $30,000 for the marble bar counters. Yes, Chloe shouted, grasping at straws. We paid that bill. It came right out of our joint account. I have the bank statements. Evelyn nodded. I'm sure you do. But let's trace the origin of those funds. She pulled out the promissory note stamped with the red default ink. 2 weeks before construction began on that tasting room, Evelyn said, holding up the document, Arthur Vance wired $50,000 into your joint account. The memo line explicitly read, Winery Business Upgrade Loan. This document, signed by both of you, states that the principal, plus 3% interest, is payable in full upon demand by the lender. She dropped the document onto the table. So, Evelyn summarized, her tone carrying the finality of a judge delivering a verdict, you used $30,000 of my client's loan to install marble bars inside my client's property. Then you pocketed the remaining $20,000 for personal luxury lifestyle expenses like skiing in Aspen, which serve absolutely no legitimate business purpose. And you have never repaid a single penny of the principal or interest. She paused, her eyes cutting through Chloe like a blade. That isn't brand equity, Chloe. In federal law, that is called embezzlement. Marshall looked down at the documents in front of him. He looked at his clients. He was finally beginning to realize that he hadn't walked into a negotiation room. He had walked into a slaughterhouse. Look, all right, Marshall said, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. Maybe the numbers are complicated, but there's a human element here. You're evicting a family with a minor child. If a jury sees this, they'll see a cold-blooded grandfather acting out of pure vindictive malice. We can argue unnecessary hardship. We can argue that your years of financial support created a reasonable expectation of permanent residency. I finally leaned forward, placing my hands flat on the table. Expectation? I said coldly. That's the core word, isn't it? You expected it. You felt entitled to it. Julian looked up at me, his eyes full of raw pleading. Dad, stop. Please, we get it. You made your point. We're broke, okay? We're drowning. I lost my job. We have nothing. Just let us stay there for a few more months until I find something else. Please, for Mia. For a split second, I felt a sharp pang in my chest. He was my son. He was in deep pain. But then I remembered the email. We need boundaries. We need peace. I remembered the invoice demanding I pay for the water pump. I remembered how they looked at me like a wallet with legs. Before I could speak, Evelyn cut off his retreat. We aren't sitting here today to discuss a lease extension, she said ruthlessly. We are here to discuss a counterclaim. A counterclaim? Marshall's voice faltered. For what? Evelyn smiled. It was the smile of a great white shark catching the scent of blood. Unjust enrichment, she said. She flipped to the final page of her binder and pulled out a single spreadsheet. At the very bottom, a massive number was heavily circled in red marker. Since Mr. Marshall wants to argue that you aren't guests, but residents with a claim to tenancy, Evelyn explained smoothly, then we must apply California landlord-tenant law, and tenants have to pay rent. She slid the paper across the table. The fair market rental value of a 4-bedroom estate villa with a private pool in Napa Valley is conservatively estimated at $12,000 a month. Since there was never a formal rent-free lease agreement, and you are now claiming adverse possession, we are officially countersuing for back rent for the past 5 years. Julian's mouth dropped open, his jaw practically unhinging. You're charging us back rent for 5 years? Evelyn nodded solemnly. 5 years, 60 months, at $12,000 a month. That comes out to $720,000. She tapped her pen against the paper. Plus the $50,000 loan, plus the accrued interest, plus our legal fees incurred during this eviction process. She turned her gaze to Marshall. The total debt your clients currently owe to Arthur Vance's trust and corporate entities is exactly $835,400. A dead, suffocating silence fell over the room. The number hung over their heads like a guillotine. $835,000. It was a staggering fortune. For a couple who couldn't even afford an $8,000 birthday party, it was a life sentence of financial ruin. Chloe began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest. You can't do this. We don't have that money. We'll go bankrupt. Evelyn snapped her black binder shut. The sound carried the finality of Judgment Day. Since you can't pay, I strongly suggest you accept our settlement offer, she said. Settlement? Marshall asked, his voice deflating like a punctured balloon. What settlement? Evelyn slid a thin sheet of paper across the mahogany wood. A mutual release and voluntary surrender, she said. The terms are simple. First, you vacate the property within 7 days. Not 30 days. 7. Second, you leave the house in broom-clean, immaculate condition. No damage. If you take so much as a light bulb from that house, we file federal theft charges. Third, you sign a strict waiver forfeiting any and all claims, direct or indirect, to the property, the winery brand, or any assets under Arthur Vance's name. And in exchange, Marshall swallowed hard. In exchange, Evelyn said, locking her eyes onto them, Arthur Vance will forgive the $835,000 in full. He wipes the back rent. He wipes the loan. He allows you to walk away with a clean credit report, zero debt, and the clothes on your back. She leaned forward, her gaze turning lethal. But this offer expires the moment you walk out that door. If you take us to court, if you file a single motion to delay the eviction, we withdraw the offer immediately. We will pursue the full amount. We will garnish your wages at any future job you land. We will place liens on any vehicle or asset you try to buy. We will trigger an IRS audit into that embezzlement. We will ensure that for the next 20 years, every single dollar you earn belongs to Arthur's trust before it ever hits your pocket. She looked at Julian. Do you want a chance to start over, Julian? Or do you want to become a permanent indentured servant to your own arrogance? Julian looked down at the thin piece of paper. He looked at the spreadsheet detailing the massive debt. He looked at Chloe, who had buried her face in her hands, completely broken and sobbing uncontrollably. He finally realized that he wasn't playing a game of domestic chicken anymore. He was up against a formal military force that held total dominance over him intellectually, financially, and legally. He had brought a water gun to a nuclear standoff. He reached for the pen, his fingers trembling so hard he could barely hold it. Dad, he whispered, looking up at me one last time. He wanted me to step in. He wanted me to save him. He was still fantasizing that I would say what I had said 1,000 times before. All right, son, you've learned your lesson. Here's the check. I looked him dead in the eyes and didn't blink. Sign it, Julian, I said coldly. It's going to be the most expensive signature of your life, but it's a bargain compared to the alternative. He signed. He signed away his illusions of owning that estate. He signed away his unearned pride. He signed away the manufactured bubble of perfection he had survived on for the last 5 years. Chloe signed next. She didn't even read the text. She just aggressively scrawled her name across the line, her tears dropping onto the paper and blurring the ink. Evelyn took the documents back, verified the signatures, and gave a firm nod. It's done, she said. You have 7 days. Next Monday at exactly 12 o'clock noon, the keys must be resting on the marble island in the kitchen. At 12:01, all locks will be changed, and private security will officially take possession of the property. Julian stood up, looking like a hollow shell of a man. He looked at me, and for the first time in his entire life, I saw a genuine sense of awe in his eyes. It was the terrified respect of a soldier who had just witnessed his commander call down a devastating airstrike. Goodbye, Dad, he said. I didn't say goodbye, and I didn't wish him luck. We'll see each other if and when we're meant to, I replied. They walked out of the conference room. Marshall followed closely behind them, looking like a defeated dog who just wanted to go home and seriously reevaluate his career choices. The moment the door clicked shut, the silence returned to the room. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was incredibly peaceful. Evelyn let out a long breath. She opened her binder, pulled out the spreadsheet detailing the $835,400 debt, and tore it right down the middle. You know, without a written lease agreement, a highly experienced trial lawyer could have easily gotten a judge to toss out those $700,000 in back rent, she said, a slight smile playing on her lips. That was pure high-pressure theater. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. The heavy rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking, allowing a single beam of sunshine to cut through and strike the skyscraper across the street. I know, I said, but they didn't. That's the difference between the people who build the underlying rules of the world and the people who just parasitize off them. We know where the load-bearing walls are. I turned back to look at her. Send the photographer back on Monday, Evelyn. Tell him the house will be completely empty this time, and make sure he gets plenty of close-up shots of the kitchen. I hear those marble countertops are highly expensive. I walked out of the office, took the elevator down, and stepped onto the street. The air after the storm smelled fresh and clean. I took a deep, clear breath. I no longer had a son to financially support. I no longer had endless commercial mortgages to balance. I was 65 years old, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely, utterly free. I walked toward my old Honda. I still had a telescope to finish polishing, and after that, maybe I really would take a trip to Aspen. I hear the winter season is beautiful up there, and I can absolutely afford it. My son's seemingly unbreakable marriage didn't end in a courtroom. It ended on the gravel driveway of the Oakmont estate, exactly 48 hours after they signed that settlement waiver. I wasn't physically there, but neighbors loved to talk. In an exclusive Napa Valley suburb that prided itself on peace and elegance, a screaming match on the front lawn was better than cable television. Mrs. Higgins, who lived right across the street, later described it to me with intense detail. She said she had never seen a woman throw clothes into Louis Vuitton luggage with such sheer violence. People always say money can't buy happiness, but a sudden total lack of money will certainly clarify your priorities. For 5 years, Julian and Chloe had been bound together by a single shared passion, spending my money. They were the perfect partners in consumer entitlement. But when that financial pipeline was severed, the partnership dissolved instantly. It turns out their vows should have read for richer or even richer, because poorer was an absolute breach of contract. According to later court filings, the collapse started the second they stepped out of Evelyn's office. The drive back was dead silent until Chloe finally erupted, screaming that Julian had defrauded her under false pretenses. She ranted that she had married a prominent winery owner with status, not a mediocre dependent who had been stripped of everything and fired by his own father. She accused him of marital fraud, weeping that he had wasted her prime branding years. She wasn't mourning the loss of their home, and she wasn't crying over the trauma Mia would face. She was mourning her fallen social status. She was mourning the trip to Aspen that was never going to happen. By Wednesday, the moving trucks arrived, but they weren't moving together. Chloe had called her parents in Santa Barbara, a middle-class couple living in a modest suburb, whom she had largely ignored ever since she married Julian and ascended into high society. Now they were her only escape hatch. She shifted into high gear as she packed her vehicle to the brim. She took everything that could be quickly liquidated. She took the premium silverware, the expensive art pieces she had purchased, and every piece of jewelry I had gifted her over the years. She didn't pack a single item for Julian. She didn't even gather Mia's toys. She only packed her own survival kit. The final standoff on the driveway was the closing act. Julian stood at the back of the luxury SUV, which was still leased under her name, practically begging her. He tried to take her hand, tears streaming down his face, asking desperately how they were going to get through this together. She laughed right in his face, a cold, sharp, piercing sound that cut across the neighborhood lawns. "Together?" she shouted. "There is no together, Julian. You're drowning, and I am not letting you drag me under with you. You are nothing now. No job, no house, and no inheritance. You're a sinking ship." She slammed the car door, never looking back at the estate she had fought to claim, or the husband she had promised to cherish. She threw the vehicle into reverse, hit the gas, and left a long black streak of burnt rubber on the pristine driveway as she sped away. The next morning, she filed for divorce unilaterally in Los Angeles. She checked the box for irreconcilable differences, but the real reason was simple math. 0 divided by 2 is still 0. She requested sole custody of Mia, not out of a sudden maternal desire to be a full-time parent, but because she recognized that child support was the very last stream of revenue she could extract from him. She didn't realize yet that 40% of a court-mandated unemployment check wouldn't even cover a cheap bottle of champagne. Julian was left standing alone on the empty driveway. The silence after her departure must have been deafening. For the first time in his 34 years, there was no one left to blame, no one left to yell at. There was only his own desperate mediocrity staring right back at him. Over the next 2 days, he moved what little remained of his personal items into a cheap self-storage unit. There really wasn't much left. Once you removed Chloe's ostentatious decor and the high-end furniture I had funded, His entire 34 years of existence fit neatly into the trunk of a rented mid-sized sedan. On Monday at exactly 12 o'clock noon, without a minute to spare, he left the heavy ring of keys resting on the marble kitchen counter, just as Evelyn had demanded. Ta walked out of the house on Oakmont Avenue, locked the door behind him, and drove away from the illusion. But he didn't drive to a new apartment downtown. He couldn't pass a single tenant screening. With no job, no savings, and a credit score in a free fall, he looked like a hazardous financial risk to any legitimate landlord. He ended up at the Starlight Motel on the outer edge of Vallejo. It was a place that charged by the week, offering towels so thin you could read a newspaper through them. The faded neon sign outside still advertised color TV and free ice as if they were luxury amenities. I drove past it one evening just to verify. I saw his rented car parked outside room 114. It was a stark contrast to his old Cayenne, a basic sedan with a dented bumper, the interior piled high with fast food wrappers. Julian sat in that musty room for days, completely paralyzed. He lay on a sagging mattress, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, listening to the heavy trucks rumble down the interstate outside. He was experiencing the severe withdrawal of an entitled life being abruptly cut short. For 34 years, he had been fiercely protected in a sterile environment, free from consequences. Now, consequences were his roommate every single night. He sent out a few resumes online, but it was half-hearted at best. In the deepest, darkest corner of his mind, he was still waiting for the rescue team to arrive. He checked his phone every single hour, desperate to see a text from me. He expected me to say, "You've learned your lesson and you've suffered enough. I've rented a nice premium apartment for you in downtown San Francisco. Come on back." But his phone didn't buzz a single time. Then the final humiliation arrived. It was late on a Tuesday night, 2 weeks after the eviction. The payments on that flashy Tesla Model X registered under Julian's name were severely past due. It was actually the only asset he had ever attempted to purchase using his own name, though he only got the loan because I had signed as a co-guarantor. But on the day I completely cut his funding pipeline, I also went through the legal process to remove myself from that guarantor list. Banks have zero patience for family drama. Julian was asleep when the tow truck arrived in the early hours of the morning. The flashing orange warning lights pierced right through the thin curtains of room 114. He ran out wearing nothing but his boxer shorts, screaming desperately into the pouring rain. He tried to block the stone-faced tow truck driver. He tried frantically to explain that he was Julian Vance, an executive, a respectable man of status. The driver didn't care. He locked the hooks into place with practiced efficiency, hoisting the Tesla, the final remaining symbol of Julian's vanity, straight up into the air. Julian stood barefoot on the oil-stained asphalt parking lot of that cheap motel, watching his very last connection to civilized society get ruthlessly dragged away into the dark. He looked incredibly small. He looked completely broken. A few other motel guests stood behind their windows, smoking cigarettes and watching the show with blank, indifferent expressions. To them, this was just another ordinary Tuesday night. He walked back into his room, entirely hollowed out, and sat on the edge of the mattress. He stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror above the dresser. He couldn't see the Napa Valley rainmaker anymore, or the glamorous vineyard patriarch. He only saw a man who had nothing left but a few stray coins in his pocket and a box of cold pizza. That night, he hit rock bottom. When a man's psychological defense network completely collapses, it makes a specific kind of sound. It isn't a hysterical scream. It's a low, muffled sob that tears out from the very bottom of the stomach. It's the sound of absolute, unconditional surrender. Julian wept uncontrollably. He cried for the vain wife who had never truly loved him. He cried for the gorgeous estate he had lost. And most of all, he cried for the father he had taken for granted and exploited for his entire life. He fumbled around, picked up his phone, and dialed my number. I was awake. I saw the caller ID. I let it ring. It wasn't out of cruelty. It was the hardest decision I have ever made in my entire life. Every instinct in my body wanted to answer that call. I wanted to drive out to that broken motel immediately, settle his bills, and buy him a new car. I wanted to make the pain stop. But I knew with absolute certainty that if I did, the suffering would be wasted. If I rescued him now, he would never learn how to rescue himself. He had to sit in that darkness long enough to realize he could survive it on his own. The ringing stopped. He didn't call back. Instead, he did something that completely caught me off guard. Early the next morning, Julian put on his last clean shirt and walked out of the motel. He walked 3 miles to the nearest bus stop. He didn't head toward a Silicon Valley startup or a luxury office tower in San Francisco. He walked into a Home Depot. An old friend of mine who happened to be a shift manager there later told me exactly what happened. Julian went straight to the manager. He didn't demand an executive role, and he didn't hand over a beautiful resume printed on premium cardstock. He looked the manager dead in the eye and said, "I need a job. I can haul lumber. I can mix paint. I can sweep floors. I will do whatever dirty work you have. I just need a job." The manager looked at his clothes, which still bore the faint trace of high-end tailoring, then looked at the pure desperation in his eyes, and handed him an application. Julian sat in the lumber aisle using an upturned plastic bucket as a desk and filled out the form. When he reached the section labeled Emergency Contact, he hesitated. The tip of his pen hovered over the paper for a long time. Then he left it blank. He was finally beginning to understand. He was completely on his own. And for the first time in his life, he realized that being alone was exactly what he needed. The fall was catastrophic. He lost the artificial wife, the manufactured home, the luxury car, and his unearned status. But standing there, surrounded by the sharp scent of sawdust and pressure-treated wood, he was about to discover something he had never possessed before, a backbone of his own. It was a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 weeks after the formal eviction notice took effect, when my son returned to the house he had once assumed he would inherit. The succulents in the front yard were thriving, showing a deep, resilient green under the California sun, completely indifferent to the human drama unfolding around them. I was on the porch, performing a final lens calibration on the vintage brass telescope for Mia. I had fully restored it. The mechanical tracks were sturdy, the focus was precise, and it was finally ready to bear weight and gaze into a real sky. I saw him walking up the driveway. He didn't have a car. He had walked all the way from the bus stop a mile away. He looked noticeably thinner. The custom, semi-permanent suits were gone, replaced by an old pair of jeans I hadn't seen him wear in a decade, and a faded, ordinary polo shirt. He walked with a slight limp, maybe from blisters in his worn-out shoes, or maybe from the heavy weight of his own shame. He no longer looked like the arrogant director of operations. He looked like a man who had just gone 12 rounds with the real world and lost badly. He stopped at the very bottom of the porch steps. He didn't try to step up. He knew he had lost the privilege of entering uninvited. "Hi, Dad," he said. His voice was incredibly hoarse. "Hello, Julian," I replied. I set down the precision screwdriver. I didn't invite him to sit. He looked down at his shoes, a cheap pair of sneakers with severely scuffed toes. "I just wanted to stop by," he began, struggling to find the words. I wanted to say I'm sorry, not just for the water pump bill or the bankruptcy, but for how I've treated you. I was so arrogant. I was a complete idiot. You were right about everything." I watched him closely. I searched that familiar face for any sign of a lie. I audited his micro-expressions the exact same way I would review a balance sheet, looking for any loophole of manipulation or theater. But for the first time in years, I found absolutely nothing. I saw only raw exhaustion. I saw a genuine fear of the unknown. "I accept your apology," I said calmly. His head snapped up, a faint glimmer of hope flashing in his eyes. He took a half step forward. "Thank you, Dad. That means everything to me. Honestly, these last few weeks have been absolute hell. Chloe took everything and left. Those blood-sucking lawyers in L.A. are stripping me clean. I'm living in a broken motel that smells like bleach and despair. I'm trying, Dad. I'm truly trying to survive. But I just need a little bit of help to get my feet back under me. Just a tiny push." And there it was. The request. The pivot. The apology was real, but it was also a key he was trying to use to unlock the vault doors once again. "I just need a deposit for an apartment," he said, speaking rapidly as if terrified I would cut him off. Just $3,000 to cover first and last month's rent. If I don't have a permanent address, I can't apply for any legitimate white-collar jobs. If you can just lend me that, I swear I'll pay you back. I'll sign a promissory note, or whatever legal paperwork you want. I looked at my son. I loved him. God, I loved him. Every single instinct, every nerve in my body was screaming at me to walk inside, grab the checkbook, and patch up his bleeding wounds. It would have been so incredibly easy. To me, $3,000 was pocket change. It was a cheap admission ticket to buy back the illusion of a happy family. But then I looked at the weathered, beautifully restored brass telescope beside me. I thought about the laws of physics and engineering. If you pour cheap, quick-dry cement into a foundation, the entire structure will experience a catastrophic failure the moment it has to bear real weight. For 30 years, I had been the cheap cement in his life. Now, I had to be the unyielding steel. I reached into the front pocket of my shirt and pulled out a plain white envelope. Julian's eyes locked onto it instantly. He thought it was a check. He thought he had won. He let out a long, ragged breath he'd been holding in his chest, his shoulders slumping with immense relief. "I knew you wouldn't let me drown, Dad," he choked out, his voice cracking. "Thank you." I walked down the steps, stood directly in front of him, and extended the envelope. He took it, his hands shaking violently. He tore open the seal immediately, desperate to grasp his salvation. He pulled out the piece of paper. It wasn't a check. It was a single printed sheet, a job application form. At the top was the corporate logo for a heavy logistics warehouse, located near the port of Oakland. Stapled to the corner was a business card for the shift foreman, a man named Miller. Julian stared blankly at the paper. He flipped it over, searching the back for cash. He ran his fingers inside the empty envelope. Nothing. "What is this?" he asked, his voice starting to shake. "It's a job," I said. "I called Miller this morning. He owed me a favor from a corporate restructuring back in 1999. His warehouse is hiring heavy forklift operators and freight handlers. It's hard, punishing labor, Julian. You'll be up at 4 in the morning, hauling heavy steel components in the freezing breeze off the San Francisco Bay. Your back will ache and your hands will bleed. It pays $20 an hour." $20? Julian looked at me in pure horror. "Dad, I used to make 6 figures. I can't survive on $20 an hour." "You can," I told him. "Tens of millions of Americans live on exactly that every single day. You're going to rent a room, not an entire apartment. You're going to take the bus. You're going to learn how to cook your own meals. And then you're going to save every single dollar you earn." "I asked you for a loan," he shouted, his voice cracking again. "I'm begging you for a lifeline." "This is the lifeline," I said, locking my eyes onto his. "Giving you cash isn't a rescue, Julian. It's a temporary fix. It numbs the pain for a moment, but it doesn't cure the underlying disease. Your disease is that you think you're too important to sweat. You think you're naturally entitled to results you never actually worked for." I stepped down closer to him, letting the full weight of my presence bear down. "If I give you that cash today, you'll be standing right back on these steps next month, demanding more. You will never change. But if you take this job, if you show up on time every single day, if you learn the exhausting fatigue of hard work instead of self-pity, then you might actually become the man I always hoped you'd be." He crumpled the paper tightly in his fist. Tears tracked through the stubble on his face. "You're cruel," he sobbed. "You're actually enjoying watching me suffer." "I don't enjoy a single second of this, Julian," I said, my voice finally thick with suppressed emotion. "This is the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. I am watching my own son bleed, but I refuse to hand you a Band-Aid, because I know this wound has to be exposed to the air before it can truly heal." I pointed at the wrinkled ball of paper in his hand. "Miller expects you at the Oakland docks tomorrow morning at 5 o'clock sharp. If you're a single minute late, the job is gone. The choice is yours, son. You can throw that paper in the trash, walk away, and keep blaming the world. Or you can catch that bus and go to work." I turned my back on him. I walked up the porch steps, one heavy footstep at a time. In that moment, a part of me desperately wanted him to yell at my back. I wanted him to throw that application at the back of my head. But he didn't. I picked up my precision screwdriver again. I didn't look back. I heard him standing there for a long time. I could hear his heavy, broken breathing. I heard the wind rustling through the succulents. Then I heard the footsteps. They were moving away, fading down the driveway. I waited until the sound completely vanished at the end of the road. Then I set my tools down and collapsed into the rocking chair on the porch, closing my eyes. A few hours later, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Evelyn. "He called Miller," the message read. "He starts tomorrow." I let out a long, slow breath. I opened my eyes and watched the spectacular California sunset paint the sky in deep shades of purple and brilliant gold. He had finally taken the fishing rod instead of demanding a free fish. I picked up my phone and opened the photo gallery, looking at a picture of Mia. She was smiling brightly at the camera, missing a front tooth. I dialed the customer service line for the bank holding her educational trust and officially authorized the monthly automatic deposits. Then I called a florist in Santa Barbara and ordered a bouquet to be sent to Chloe's parents' house. The card attached read simply, "For Mia." In this conflict, I wasn't a villain, and I wasn't a hero. I was just a forensic accountant, a father. I had simply learned to calculate the vital difference between real love and total enablement. People always think love is a soft wool blanket. They think love is saying yes to a child without limits. They think love means sheltering someone from the cold wind forever. But sometimes, real love is a cold, hard wall. Sometimes love is the person who stands firmly at the door and tells you no, forcing you to find your own way through the storm. It cost me an immense price, the temporary loss of my relationship with my son, and the destruction of a perfect illusion. But as I sat in the gathering darkness, I knew I had purchased something priceless. I bought him back his dignity as a man, and I bought myself true peace. Tomorrow, I'm going to the post office to mail this telescope to Mia. Then I'm going to drive down the Pacific coastline. I want to watch the rough waves smash against the rocks on the cliffs, seeing how centuries of relentless pressure polish those sharp, fragile stones into unbreakable smooth sand. Life is difficult. Sooner or later, it breaks all of us. But it's through that total destruction and rebuilding that we find out exactly what we are made of. My name is Arthur Vance. I am an auditor who specializes in dismantling and rebuilding. And today I finally laid down the first solid foundation of my son's life. Thank you for listening to my audit report. If you've ever had to practice this kind of harsh, tough love on someone you care about, or if you were the one who had to be broken to finally learn how to stand, tell me your story in the comments below. Always remember, the strongest steel is only forged in the hottest, most painful fires. I'll see you next time.